So this is the book here. I'm sure I don't know if you guys have it or not.
Yeah.
It's huge, and this is pretty much your Bible as a pilot. I mean, it is. It's got every single rule and regulation that the FAA has, and basically what they say is you have to follow every rule, and if you break even one of them, you're technically in violation. And there's a lot of real tiny rules in there. But this study guide book that I got from here kind of explains, and it goes over the bigger points that you guys would need to know for the private test, the written, oral, and the practical exam. So again, FARs, if you can notice on this book here, it's also got FAR aim. There we go, hold it up there. So it's got FAR aim on it, and the AIM part, that stands for Aeronautical Information Manual. So that's not technically a rule book, but they include it in the FAR aim just as it's just a book of instructions. So it gives tips, pointers, how to deal with ATC and how to fly in the National Airspace System. So it's almost like a little guidebook in addition to the regulations and all that. So for example, taking a look at FARs, you're going to see a lot of problems or a lot of questions that the FAA is going to pose will look like this. It'll state 14 CFR, and then I'm just going to pick a random number, 61.109. That's the example that the workbook used. So that actually means this 14 here means, oh, hey, how are you?
Pretty good, how are you?
Good. I'm Evan.
Hi,
Nice to meet you. We just got into FARs. So it's just basically the rules and regulations of the sky. Do you have this book here?
Is it in Gleam or whatever?
I think it is.
If it is, I should have.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. So it's basically, just to catch you up, it's all of your rules and regulations of the sky. It's what the FAA publishes, and it says you have to follow all these rules, and there's a million of them. So that's basically where we left off now. Okay, so back to it. So this chapter 14, it is the Code of Federal Regulations, chapter 14. So for example, I'm not sure exactly which one it is, but you'll have the Department of Transportation will put out railroad regulations or vehicle regulations or ship regulations. And those will be, chapter 7, chapter 11, what have you. But the aviation one is specifically chapter 14. So if you see 14 CFR, it's talking about aviation. Code Federal Regulations again. And this 61109 is part 61, section 109. So that's basically how you're going to read the regulation. And I'll get into the parts here in a little bit and what they all mean. There's a common mistake, and I'll write this up here too, that people put FAR 61109. Technically, that's correct. It's talking about the exact same thing, but you're never going to see an FAA publication out there that puts it as FAR 61109. It'll always be the 14 CFR. Because I know when I went through my pilot training, I was really confused when I started seeing this, and what does it mean? What's going on here? But so that's what they mean, and that's how they basically will title the book, and that's how it's all sorted in here in your FAR aim. Is everybody good with this? Am I good to erase it?
Yeah, no problem.
Sounds good. All righty. So let's see here. Again, the AIM is in the back of the book, and it talks about basically your flight information, like I said, ATC procedures, information on airspace and everything. I don't know, have you guys had airspace yet, or?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
very first.
Okay, excellent. So you guys know all about airspace. That's good. So we'll get in now to the parts of the FARs, and I mean, it's got hundreds of parts. However, the Gleam book brought up a few of the major ones, and those are the ones that we'll go over tonight. So I'll list them out here. First one is going to be part 1. Next one was part 21. Then we got part 39. Part 43. And then let's see, part 61. Part 67, and then part 91. And then there's a few other parts that are pertinent to aviation, just really not to the general aviation world. And I'll just write those down. I'll just talk about them real quick as an example. You got part 121, part 141. And then you have a different one, and it's actually going to be covered in the next ground school topic, but I'm just going to introduce it tonight. It's NTSB part 830, which is pretty, that's an interesting one. Okay, so I'll just go down and explain these parts here. So part 1 is obviously the very first part in the FAR. That is all of your definitions and abbreviations. So it'll go through basically anything that they're going to mention in that book, anything from an airplane, aviator, airman, I guess they call it, civil aircraft, type of aircraft. It's going to tell you exactly what the FAA means when they use that term. And it's also going to give you all of your abbreviations. For example, I was using NAS, so National Airspace System. So it'll just tell you all that basic information about that stuff. And that's basically all that's in part 1. It's just familiarizing you with what's going to be coming in the book. Up next is part 21. Part 21 is the certification for products and parts. So basically, it's how you certify the airplane parts when you work on the airplane. It goes through the rules and procedures in doing that in accordance with the FARs. So for example, you can't just, let's say the fuel filter went on the Archer. I'm not too big mechanically inclined, but you can't just go to AutoZone and buy a car fuel filter and put it in there. It has to be an FAA approved part by part 21. Part 39 covers ADs, which are airworthiness directives. And I'll get into the ADs in a little bit here. I'm just going to introduce the part. Part 43, that's your maintenance. So it's almost in part with 21, except 43 describes the process and the how you want to work on the airplane. The approved process of who can work on the airplane, what kind of maintenance can be done by who on the airplane, and who has to inspect it at the end. Part 61, that's a big one. That's what you guys are all training under here. And that is basically your pilot certification. So, and it covers not only you guys, it covers anybody that's training to be instrument, commercial, airline transport pilot, and it goes through the whole process, everything that's required, everything that you need, it does that. Part 67, that's your medical. So when you go, I assume that you guys all have medicals, right?
I'm getting mine tomorrow.
Getting yours tomorrow. Okay, perfect. Awesome. So that covers your medical, and that's what your AME, the medical examiner, he has to abide by the rules in part 67 in giving you your medical. It says you have to have 20/20 vision, 20/40 vision for, I think it's a class 3. So that's the part that he's going to adhere by. Part 91, those are your rules and regulations of the sky. And that's kind of what these parts are too. So part 91 is your rules and regulations of just any civil aircraft operator. So if I were to go right now, grab the keys to the Archer and go flying, I'd be covered under part 91. So I'd have to follow part 91 rules. Part 121 rules, those are airline rules. So anytime that the airlines fly, or what the FAA calls a scheduled air carrier, they fly under part 121. Part 141 are aviation colleges. So like, for example, Embry-Riddle down south, or I believe there's one in Arizona, I forget the name of it now, but the professional aviation colleges operate under part 141. Actually, where I went to school out in Beaver, Community College of Beaver County, they were a part 141 school. So they had a whole other set, it's a stricter set of rules and regulations that they have to follow. And then you've got NTSB part 830, which just covers the aircraft accident reporting and what to do with the wreckage afterwards. But like I said, that's going to be in the next ground lesson. I was just wanted to introduce it tonight as one of the parts of the the FAR aim. So I'll go ahead and get a little bit deeper into them. So part 1 is pretty self-explanatory. So I'll go ahead and start with part 21 here. which is the certification of the aircraft parts and procedures. Let's see, I'll give myself a little more room. All right, so part 21. Let's see, I'll take a look at my notes here. Okay, so basically it describes the category of airplane. So you have what's called a normal category, utility category airplane. And all that's going to follow under what's called a standard airworthiness certificate. Standard airworthiness certificate. Now, every airplane that you fly out there legally has to have an airworthiness certificate from the FAA. And there's two types of them. There's a standard one, like I mentioned, and then there's a special airworthiness certificate. So I'll write this one down here. Okay, perfect, right there. So like I said, your standard airworthiness certificate, that's going to cover your normal static. It's got hot air balloon in there, just to name a few different categories of airplanes. So all of these have to have a standard airworthiness certificate. That's like, your Pipers, your Cessnas, everything that comes out of the shop, for the aerobatic category, your pits and your extras and all that. Now, the special airworthiness certificate is, exactly as the name implies, it's for a special circumstance. So for example, that will be like a light sport aircraft would need one of these. And experimental will need one too. Now, experimental is a big one because that's probably the most popular type of special airworthiness certificate out there. That's like, if you build an airplane from a kit at home, it's going to need an experimental airworthiness certificate because the FAA can't legally certify it as standard because you did the work on it. It's not a plane from a factory and everything. So basically, the airworthiness certificate of an airplane is required to be on board at all times. And it also is good for the life of the airplane. When the airplane leaves the factory and it's airworthy, it's got that FAA stamp of approval on it. It's good for the lifetime of the airplane as long as it's maintained properly and in accordance with the FARs. So we'll get into that a little bit, talking about the maintenance regulations and what's needed for that. Okay, any questions on this, on the airworthiness, part 21 for the parts of the airplane? All good. Am I good to erase? Everybody all good?
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, perfect. So let's see here. Now, staying on the topic of airworthiness, there's something the FAA will issue sometimes called a special flight permit. So basically, a special flight permit, if you have an airplane that is not airworthy by FAA standards, but it's still safe to fly, you can get a special flight permit, and it's a very special circumstance that airplane's allowed to fly in. So for example, just a couple weeks ago, we had to take an airplane that was broken in Pittsburgh and fly it to Macon, Georgia, which we have a maintenance facility there, because the airline industry was devastated by COVID and all the airplanes sat for a very, very long time. They're now, with the influx in people coming back, they're starting to bring these airplanes out of storage and back into the sky. So this airplane was out of inspection, and the escape slides were not inspected anymore. So it wasn't legal to carry passengers per Part 121 standards, which I'll get into in a little bit. So to fly it down there, we actually had to obtain a special flight permit from the FAA because technically it wasn't legal to fly, but it was still airworthy. It still flew down there just fine. We just had to get it down there so they could do the required inspections and make it airworthy again. So like I said, there's a few more examples of what you'll need. So like the one I just used, flying for maintenance or flying to a maintenance facility. Another circumstance would be delivering an airplane. Another one would be like a flight test. And then let's see here, and this is a good one, evacuation. So let's say you had an airplane that wasn't legal to fly by FAA standards. So you had to get a special flight permit for it because a natural disaster was coming. So let's say you're living down in Florida, there's a hurricane warning, you have this old airplane sitting in the hangar that you know would get destroyed, but you know it can still fly, but it's not technically legal to have a standard airworthiness certificate. So you can get a special flight permit to evacuate that airplane to another location. Now, the special flight permit comes with a very, very strict set of rules and regulations that you have to follow. So for example, it's over, let's see, it's issued by the FAA. Let me see if I get some room here. Everybody good with this? I'll erase it if you guys all good.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. So like I said, it's issued by the FAA, and there's a certain amount of criteria that they need to know before they'll sign off. So for example, they're going to need to know the purpose of the flight. So let's use the example of the airplane that we have to evacuate before a hurricane comes. So our purpose, we're going to tell the FAA, is I have to get it out of this airport or the airplane is going to become totally destroyed. The next one is an itinerary. So the FAA has to know exactly what you plan to do with that airplane and exactly where you plan to go. So let's say we're sitting in Miami and we got to fly the airplane to Atlanta. We're going to say, okay, I'm going to fly this airplane because I need to evacuate it from the hurricane, and I'm going to take it from Miami and fly it up to Atlanta where it's going to be safe. Then third, they're going to need to know the crew. So basically, who's going to be on that airplane? And typically, on a special flight permit, only the required crew members are going to be on that airplane. So let's say, for example, if the Archer happened to require 2 pilots, you'd have to have the names of both pilots identified, and they'd have to be on board for that flight. And then you have to explain why it isn't airworthy. So for in the case that we just had, ours wasn't airworthy because the escape slides for the passengers were out of inspection, so they weren't allowed to be used. So that meant that only myself and the captain were allowed to be on that airplane at the time. Another good example is, let's say you have an airplane that has retractable landing gear and there's a malfunction somewhere in the system. The gear won't go up or down. You could get a special flight permit, and let's say you can't do the maintenance here, in Indiana. You could get a special flight permit to ferry it to a maintenance facility, again, like we mentioned before, and you would just have to say why, because I need to fix my landing gear. So the conditions that they would issue with that is, okay, you have to fly it with the gear down if it won't go up. So because it's not technically airworthy, because everything has to be working, the landing gear, it's still able to go under a special flight permit. You just have to fly it with the gear down, like the condition. And let's see here. That's the next one, actually, restrictions. So you would just have to put that down as a restriction, as I'm going to fly this airplane with the gear down, or, let's say the door won't properly latch. I'm going to have to fly it with the latch unlatched, what have you, is that's what would require the special flight permit. And finally, any other pertinent information. So basically anything else that you need to tell them about that flight. So basically, it's a special circumstance, special flight permit. That's the way that I used to remember it. And that's a big one under Part 21. And the workbook mentions that as well. Let's see here. And oh yeah, before I move on, it's a one-time thing. So the special flight permit doesn't mean that it's good to go, wherever. It's only good for one flight. So if you had to take it somewhere else and, you get to your destination and, oh, they don't have the maintenance here to fix it, then you're gonna have to obtain another one to be able to get it where you need it to take it. Does anybody have any questions on this at all? Does it make sense for the most part?
Is it like an immediate thing to get your special, like to get a special flight permit, or does it take quite a while?
Typically, it'll be pretty immediate. Like if you show up and it's, as soon as you call the FAA, they'll get working on it. Now, it's a whole other thing if you're going to get the FAA, because I've definitely had some trouble calling them before, to schedule check rides or anything like that, and they've, been a little slow with it. But technically, yeah, you could get it right away. For sure. All right. Everybody good with part 21?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, so the next one that it explains is part 39. All right, so part 39, this is what I mentioned earlier as your ADs. So the ADs stand for Airworthiness Directives. Airworthiness directives. Now, have you guys heard of ADs before?
Oh, yeah.
I bet you have, Sean, but okay, so airworthiness directives, it's another thing to do with maintenance. So I like to think of it, the way that I've always remembered it, it's an easy way to remember. It's like a recall on your car. So the airplane, same kind of thing. Let's say that they come out of the factory, they're flying around for a while, and suddenly a part on one malfunctions. The FAA, during the course of their investigation and ultimately to resolve the issue, will typically order an airworthiness directive, and they'll say, okay, every airplane that is this type of airplane has to have this component replaced or inspected because it failed before, and we're trying to prevent it from failing again. Does that make sense? So it's exactly like a recall on your car. So a good example of one is that happened a few years ago. There was an airplane, I don't know if you guys have heard of it or not, down in, it was an Embry-Riddle airplane down in Daytona Beach. It was a Piper Arrow, and they were flying and they took off doing some pattern work, and the wing snapped off and ended up unfortunately killing the student and I think he was on a check ride, the DPE. So the FAA, I think quite recently, after their investigation, issued an airworthiness directive that all Piper models have to have that wing spar inspected as a result of that accident. So that's a real world example of one that just happened. Now, older airplanes, we're going to have a laundry list of ADs, and there's a multitude of different kinds, like I said, enhanced inspections or replacing parts. It all depends on which component had faltered in the first place. Let's see here. Okay. So the ADs, not only that, they have to be accompanied with some more special set of standards. For example, special instructions such as to replace the parts or inspect the airplane again, like I said. But that's all pretty much what Part 39 details as the airworthiness directives or ADs. And part of the, if you're out there buying an airplane, flying a new airplane, part of your inspection should be to check to make sure that the airworthiness directives have been complied with, because if they haven't, that airplane is technically not airworthy. It makes it illegal to fly per the FAR standards. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about ADs? All good? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All righty. Let's see here. We'll move on to part 43. All right, so part 43. This is our maintenance part. So this deals with maintenance, any rebuilds, altercation, or let's see here, alterations. There we go, not altercations. And also a big one in this part that it describes is preventive maintenance. And I'll go into that one pretty deep. Preventive maintenance. So, basically the mechanics are going to follow Part 43. That outlines everything that they have to do. But a big one for, private pilots is you're actually allowed to perform preventive maintenance on an airplane. And I'll get into that here in just a sec. So basically, preventive maintenance can be done by anybody that has a private pilot's license. And it's basically, the aircraft has to be a private airplane. So it has to be an airplane that, let's say, you own or that you rent. No, that it cannot be a transport category airplane, which is an airliner. It can't be an corporate jet or anything like that. It could just be the plane that you fly as a private pilot. So basically, it allows you to perform maintenance that's going to prevent something from happening in the future. That's why it's called preventive maintenance. So for example, you can replace the tires on an airplane. You can refill hydraulic fluid. You can service the struts on the airplane. And you can change the landing light bulbs. All right, so this is all stuff that can prevent something big from happening, which is why the FAA allows you to do it. So for example, go out there, repair and replace the tires. Let's say you're doing your walk around and you find a tire that's about to blow. It's got, the cord showing in it, and you have an extra tire in there. You can go ahead and grab that tire and replace it. And there you go. You prevented that from happening. You can refill your hydraulic fluid, service the struts, change your landing light bulbs. If you're flying at night, you're obviously going to want to have a landing light so you can see where you're going and where the runway is coming into land. So preventive maintenance is all to prevent something bigger from happening. So the FAA outlines that in Part 43. However, you can't just perform preventive maintenance and go and fly and everything's okay. There's one thing that you have to do. Everybody go with this list? Can I erase it? Cool. So you're going to have to go into the aircraft maintenance records. And you're basically going to have to say that you did this maintenance on the airplane. So the FAA requires that you sign it. So you're going to need your signature. You're going to need your certificate number, just your pilot certificate number. You're going to need the kind of certificate. And what they mean by that is, is it a private pilot certificate? Or you could even be a sport pilot performing maintenance on your aircraft, or a recreational pilot. They just want you to put whichever kind of certificate you have on there, the date of the maintenance, and then finally, the description of the work that you did. And that's all you have to put in the aircraft maintenance records, and that is totally legal for preventive maintenance. Now, does that make sense? The preventive maintenance, do you guys have any questions on that?
I have one. A student doesn't qualify for that?
What's that?
Would a student doesn't qualify to be a certificate?
A student does not. Yeah, you have to have at least your private pilot certificate. So if you're a student pilot, you can notify the instructor. The instructor can perform preventive maintenance. But the FAA says you have to have at least a private pilot certificate to do it. Yeah.
All right.
Now there are some more on that, like that you're allowed to do, but those were just a few examples. But yeah, exactly. Oil changes you can definitely do. as preventive maintenance. You just have to follow this for the FAA, because if there's a maintenance inspector that were to come in and say, oh, let me take a look at these maintenance records, and this is missing, you can definitely get in all sorts of trouble with them. They like to make sure that all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. So they become sticklers with it, especially on the maintenance side. Does that all make sense? Okay, good. Let's see here. So now, and just one more note on the preventive maintenance is it's not major at all. If you guys noticed, it's all stuff to prevent bigger things from happening. So they're not going to let you change a wing on the airplane or anything like that. All right. Let's see here. Okay, and then we got part 61. Now, part 61 is huge. Like I said, it's your certification, and it covers the pilot certificates, it covers certified flight instructor certificates, it covers ground instructor certificates, basically anything, any sort of certification. So, and there's going to be subparts for every certificate. So, for example, in the pilot certificate, you're going to have a subpart for student pilots, private pilots, instrument ratings, commercial pilot certificates, airline transport pilot certificates. Everything has its own set of rules and regulations. For example, training requirements as well. So I don't know, I haven't taught private in a while. So I think if I remember correctly, you have to have 10 hours or so of cross-country time. So part 61 outlines that and what qualifies as a cross-country. So have you guys done cross-countries yet, or not yet? Okay, so. All right. So when you get into cross-country flying, part 61 outlines it as anything that's from point to point, and it has to be at least 50 miles in length. So that's just an example of what part 61 gives, is it gives you the guidance of how to successfully and how to follow the correct amount of training. I think another thing is you have to have so much instrument time or simulated instrument time, and the FAA will define the simulated instrument time as any time that you're basically flying by reference to instruments that you can't see outside. And again, that's another one that you go to part 1 for the abbreviations and the definitions is, okay, what does the FAA say that instrument time is? Because there's definitely a couple in there that will say one thing, but the FAA kind of means it's a little bit of a gray area. But that's all outlined in part 61. And I'll actually flip to it here. Let's see here. All right, and it just basically will talk about too your privileges and limitations as a private pilot. Now, one of the important things is once you get your certificate, so the private pilot certificate never expires. It's good for life as long as you stay current. And that's another thing part 61 is huge on, is what's called recency of experience. So I'll write this one here on the board. All righty, so recency of experience. So that is the FAA outlining what you have to do to stay current as a pilot and make sure that you're staying safe as well. So the big thing is you're going to need a BFR, and that stands for Biennial Flight Review. Now, if you haven't heard of a BFR, that is, you're going to have to go up with an authorized instructor, certified flight instructor, and you have to do 1 hour on the ground covering everything from cross-country planning to airworthiness, just to make sure that you still have the knowledge that is required by the FAA for you to fly. And then you do an hour in the air. So you're going to go up and do all of your basic maneuvers again, your steep turns, stalls, slow flight, just to make sure that you can still do it and you're still current with it. And then obviously some takeoffs and landings as well. So that has to be done because of biennial flight review every 2 years, 24 months. The FAA requires that to stay current. Now, a little bit stricter they do as well. If you haven't flown, the FAA requires that every 90 days, you do 3 takeoffs and landings. Now, these have to be done for both daytime and nighttime. So you can't do 3 takeoffs and landings and automatically be current to fly at night as well. So for the daytime, 3 takeoffs and landings. And those can be touch and goes. The nighttime ones, however, have to be to a full stop. And I'll put full stop here. So for example, it is definitely possible for you to be day current, but not night current. And that's another part where part 61 comes in is, okay, what is nighttime? Because the FAA defines it as the period from 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. That's when you're legally allowed to log these night landings. However, there's the period from end of evening civil twilight to the end of morning civil twilight, which you're allowed to log nighttime. And like I said, part 61 explains all of that, what the FAA considers nighttime, what they say is acceptable to get your currency and acceptable for your daytime currency. And it's also possible, to be night current and not day current, especially in the wintertime where it's more nighttime than daytime. So that's all stuff that once you guys do get your licenses, that you're gonna have to keep track of, is getting your BFR and especially staying current with these 90 days. I know my currency just lapsed and I was talking to Brad about, I'm probably gonna be in here tomorrow to do my 3 takeoffs and landings so that I am legal to fly. Now, this currency is category and class of airplane. So for example, flying a multi-engine airplane, you could be multi-engine current, but not current in a single engine, if that makes sense. So every 90 days, you have to go up in a single engine and do your 3 takeoffs and landings, or go up in a multi-engine and do your 3 takeoffs and landings. It just doesn't cover the whole thing. The BFR though, that covers your certificate. So that covers every type of airplane that you can fly. Now, I don't know if many of you plan on going further in your certification, getting the instrument rating or the commercial pilot certificate. But every time you take a check ride for a new rating or certificate, that resets your BFR. So you could essentially, for example, myself, we have to go to the simulator every year at the airline and get checked out again. That counts towards our BFR. So, for example, with flying in the airlines, you could go your entire career without even needing a BFR because you're constantly getting checked by the FAA. Does that make sense? So as long as, you're pursuing more ratings, you can go without a BFR because every time you ride with your designated pilot examiner, that resets your clock. Now, like I said, if you're just getting your private, that's when you have to start keeping track of your BFR. And you'd have to do that with a certified flight instructor. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay, perfect. Like I said, it's all outlined in part 61. That's just one of the big parts of it. And the FAA, like I said, it's probably the biggest part in the book. It's very important. So let's see. Another part of 61, we'll talk about the medical certificate. All right, so your medical certificate. So to be able to act as PIC, pilot in command of an airplane, you have to have a valid photo ID, your student pilot certificate, a logbook endorsement, and then your medical certificate. But let's say that you have your private pilot's license. You don't need your logbook endorsement, obviously. You can just have your photo ID, your pilot certificate, and then your medical. So you always have to have a current medical certificate, because even if your pilot certificate doesn't expire, the medical certificate does. So if you don't have a current medical and you're out there flying around, then you don't have a current pilot certificate. Those two are always intertwined. So there's 3 classes you can get of medical certificate. You have your first class, you have your second class, and then you have your third class. And then there's a 4th option that's called basic med, which I'll get into here in a little bit. So all of these classes vary in how strict they are. For example, the strictest one is your first class medical, and then it obviously goes down to second, down to third, and your basic med is the most lenient of them all. And they're all valid for different periods of time. For example, you're going to have to go revisit the AME and renew your medical certificate depending on which class you have. So talking for a first class, this is what is required for the ATP. So to fly for the airlines, you have to have a first class medical certificate. And that one, like I said, is the most strict. And in terms of renewing it, if you're younger than 40, you have to get it renewed every year. So every year you're gonna have to go see the AME 12 months and get it renewed. If you're older than 40, however, you have to get it renewed every 6 months. So you'll be visiting the AME quite frequently then. Second class medical, that is for your commercial. So for those of you that want to pursue a commercial certificate, to be able to fly commercially, which is, for example, anything getting paid to fly. So it could be banner towing, it could be towing skydivers or giving rides to skydivers, anything like that, sightseeing flights, anything that requires your commercial pilot certificate. That one, no matter what you are or how old you are, above or below 40 is 12 months that you'll have to get it renewed. And then finally, you have your third class medical certificate, which is just the basic one. I mean, I had a third class when I was going through flight training, and it is the most lenient of them all. And if you're younger than 40, that one's actually valid for 60 months. It's valid for 5 years. If you're over 40, it's valid for 2 years, 24 months. So let's say that I just went to the AME 2 days ago. So it was at March 16th. I have a first class, so I'm younger than 40, which means at this time next year, I'll have to go again. But I have till the end of March, if that makes sense. So you don't have to go to the date of your exam. You have until the end of that month to get your medical. And that's how the FAA interprets this rule here. So let's say that I have a second class certificate. And let's say that I let it expire. So I go past my 12 months and it's done. You don't just lose that medical. It will actually drop to a third class at that point, and you'll still have it for the rest of these 60 months if you're younger than 40. Does that make sense? Kind of how they do that. So you could be flying commercially, let's say I'm giving rides to skydivers, getting paid for it. I accidentally let my second class expire. So I can no longer do that. However, I still have a medical. I still have a third class medical. I just have to go and get it renewed as a second class. Does that make sense? Any questions on this so far, the medical stuff?
I'm good.
All right. And then finally, we have basic med. And basic med's a weird one. It's actually fairly new. It's an option for, somebody that just wants to go out and fly, fly by yourself, not getting paid for it, nothing of the sorts. You cannot instruct under basic med. And what it is you can go to a doctor, and I think it's an FAA form. It was fairly new when I left the instructing world, but you can go to a doctor, and as long as you check out medically with them, then there's your medical certificate. So it's not technically a first, second, or third class, and it's the most restrictive of them all, but that's another option that you can have is flying under basic med. Those are typically for your weekend warriors that are just out there flying for fun during the summertime. Does this all make sense? Any questions on that? All good. And let's see here. So moving on. And the last part that the units cover is part 67. And there's really not too much to talk about with part 67. Part 67 is like we were just talking about the medical requirements. However, it's what covers your AME. So part 61 says what you have to do as a pilot and, what your medical certificate has to do. And part 67 tells your AME what he has to check for. So, for example, your equilibrium test, you have to get your hearing checked, your eyes checked. That's all outlined in part 67, and that's what the AME is going to refer to whenever they do your medical and do your physical exam. And then let's see here. And that is actually, that's the end of the set of chapters. So do you guys have any questions on FARs? Anything that we covered today you want me to go over again? Or anything you want me to explain a little bit more?
The basic med thing, is that more like light sport pilots?
Yeah, light sport pilots can use it, if they're not planning on doing anything too crazy, you can definitely use basic med, but private pilots are also able to get it as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just very restrictive.
Like the passenger wise, you mean just basically yourself, that's it?
Pretty much, exactly, yeah. So you'll need a third class if you want to take any passengers, exactly just like you'll need a private pilot certificate to be able to run passengers. Now, getting paid for it, that starts to get into your commercial certificate. So for that, in that case, you need a second class medical for that.
Okay.
Let's see, and then I think the next time it mentioned it's going to go into part 91 that I had written on the board earlier in the NTSB part 830, which deals with those aircraft accidents and reporting them and everything like that. But as far as what we covered today, if anything you guys want me to go into a little further.
One thing that I've heard the term ferry permit. I assume that was the same thing as a special permit for flight. What you talked about earlier. It's the same thing as a ferry permit.
Yeah, ferry permit. Yeah, exactly. It'll be that you can ferry an airplane from point A to point B. So it's typically, you're going to see that mostly with maintenance. So like if the airport that the airplane's at doesn't have the sufficient maintenance to be done on it, or the capabilities, I should say, you're going to need that to ferry it to another airport to be able to get that maintenance done. Or let's say there's an aircraft that had an engine problem and had to land off airport in a cornfield. But the cornfield still, it's long enough that the airplane could take off again. You could put mechanics in there, fix that airplane up, and get a special flight permit to fly it out of the cornfield into an airport. That'd be another instance of where you need one. But basically anything that's irregular, anything where the airplane is not airworthy or doesn't meet the standards of the FAA, and it's still safe enough to fly. And then they'll determine if your case is, if it's safe enough to fly and it's good enough to issue a special flight permit, then they'll actually go ahead and give you one.
Even something simple like my plane's out of annual and it needs to go to another mechanic at another airfield or something.
Exactly. Yep. You could definitely do a special flight permit for that because, it would be unairworthy because it's out of annual. But if you don't have the capability to do it right there, then and you need to get it there, and you can say, oh yeah, I know this airplane, it's not just going to break because it hasn't flown, because since the annual passed, then they'll issue a special flight permit to be able to ferry it to that maintenance facility to get that annual done.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. All righty. Yeah, FARs, it's a huge book and there's a lot of material in there. It's not made to memorize, it's made to just, as a reference material for you. And like I said, there's just a lot of stuff in there that the FAA is very particular about. But, as long as you're following the FARs to the best of your ability, everything's totally fine.
You had mentioned changing oil. Was that something that is not anybody can do?
Yep, that's preventive maintenance.
Okay. Because I did that on my plane, but I did change the tires on my plane, but I believe the mechanic had noted it when he did the annual on the plane that I did it, but he noted it off, I think, or something.
Yeah, that's good too. If he signed off on the work, that means that he inspected your preventive maintenance, so that's perfectly legal as well.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and obviously, filling oil in the airplane, that's not preventive maintenance, you can just do that. You can top the oil off. Of course, you note that you topped it off in the maintenance binder, but you don't have to go into the maintenance record and say, hey, I added oil into this airplane, because it would just be line after line of,
Yeah, really.
to pour oil in and all that. So that you're good to do that just at your prerogative. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. But cool. And I mean, I don't know if anybody here is also thinking about going further in aviation or going to the airline track, but you guys can feel free to ask me any questions about that. I'd be happy to answer for you.